Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes. So for those folks that are still grabbing a bite, please go ahead and do so. But then if you can start to make your way towards seats, again, we'll try to start in about 5 minutes. Thanks.
Hello, welcome. If everybody could take their seats, we're going to get the program started. Hi, I'm Jake Braun. I teach cyber policy here at the University of Chicago Harris School and also teach election security. I was the White House liaison to the Department of Homeland Security in the Obama administration and will be emceeing the event today. So before we get started, I'm just going to do two quick things. One, tell you why we're all here, and then two, go through introductions of our different speakers. But before that, I wanted to give a special kind of shout out to all the students that are in the room here. There's a lot of us who are working on these issues on a day-to-day basis, but it's great to see that the future leaders of our country and our world, since I guess we're at the International House, are taking this issue seriously and coming here to learn about some of the stuff that hopefully we're going to get right, and maybe from some of the stuff that we don't get right. So thank you to all the students who are here. And by the way, to my students, your extra credit for showing up is duly noted. Why are we here? We're here because today I think we have, to our best estimation, two firsts. Our first, as it were, is that we believe this is the first time since the attacks on our election in 2016 by the Russian government that we've had a public conversation with leaders from the national security world, the homeland security world, and the election security world all in one place, talking about how we can secure our democracy and elections. Secondly, our second first is that the team here in Cook County, Illinois, has put together what we believe to be one of the most robust, frankly, gold standard security programs that has come out since the 2016 election attacks by the Russians. And so I think anybody who is a voter in Cook County should actually be very proud of your government officials. I know most of the time, they're only in the news if something bad happens. Well, in this particular case, the folks at Cook County, David Orr, Noah Prayetz, and others have really worked tirelessly for the last about a year coming up with this election security program. And I want to be the first person in the program today to say that we desperately need Congress to read this plan and to fund it. These state and locals don't have the money to protect themselves against a nation state that's an existential threat to the United States. That's the federal government's job, and it's Congress's job to pay for that. So we're excited to hear from the folks in Cook County about their plan. Just to go through introductions really quick, Doug Lute was the most recent U.S. ambassador to NATO. He has also worked in the Bush and Obama White Houses, has spent 40 years in the military on, among other things, what Russia is doing in the world and how we can combat their attacks on our democracy. Secondly, Sean McCloskey from DHS is the branch chief of the cybersecurity election division. Sean's internationally recognized cybersecurity and election security expert, and this is his day job. This is what he does all day. So we're really excited to hear what DHS is doing on this issue. And then our third speaker, Noah Prayetz, works at Cook County and is the one who, along with his team, has put together this election security program. And we're really excited to have him go through this today, which again will be the first time that's happened since the 2016 election. Then that'll be followed by a panel discussion led by Frank Taylor, who's like Doug also an ambassador and a general, so I never know what to call him. But most recently, he was the Undersecretary for the Intelligence Division of Homeland Security, which was the division that did the vulnerability assessment leading up to the 2016 elections. So Frank's going to give some remarks from a Homeland and intelligence perspective, and then moderate the panel. All the people I mentioned before are going to be on the panel, and they'll be joined by Sherri Ramsay, who I believe is the only human ever to run offense and defense at NSA at different times in her career. So she has a very deep understanding of not only cybersecurity, but also what the Russians are up to and the Russian threat. And then finally, last but definitely not least, is Hari Hursty, who may be the world's foremost election hacker expert. He's been hacking voting equipment for nearly 2 decades, and actually, along with me, ran the vote hacking village at the largest hacker conference in the world this past summer. He was the technical brains behind it. At this event, about him and 20,000 hackers were beating on a bunch of election equipment, and they took down the first machine in a matter of minutes remotely, no physical access. And so Hari will be joining them on the panel as well. So with that, I want to turn it over to Ambassador Lute. Doug?
So thanks, Jake. It's good to see the students here. I'm not sure if you're here for the substance or the lunch. So we'll see how that goes, and we'll rest the judgment here on the sophistication of your questions to the panel. So you're on the hook here in a minute. I want to start by saying thanks to the university and to the Harris School for hosting us. I mean, this is a beautiful setting. It's nice to be outside of Washington and talking about this subject in Heartland America. I grew up, frankly, not far from here, so it's nice to, in a way, come home. As Jake mentioned, I think this is a bit of a unique experience today at lunch. I think for the first time we're bringing together three communities that typically don't talk to one another and sometimes don't even acknowledge one another. And by these three communities, I mean the cybersecurity community, the national security community, and local voting officials. So I think this is really a unique opportunity to put these three dimensions of election security all together on the same panel and open them up to your questions. Now, these three communities themselves really make my fundamental point today. I have really just one point, and that is that last year's cyber attacks on America's voting process are as serious a threat to our democracy, to our national security, as any of as I have seen in over 40 years of government experience. Now, it's kind of ironic, you know, on the way here from Washington today, I was reminded today's December 7th, right? Pearl Harbor Day. So, I mean, my generation and frankly, my parents' generation remembers that as an iconic event in national security, right? In fact, historically, it's one of only two such substantial physical attacks on the American homeland. So you have Pearl Harbor and 9/11. And that's really where history begins and ends in terms of physical attacks on America. I think last year's, 2016's, cyber attacks on the American democratic process are just as serious and maybe even more serious a national security threat. Look, you can recover from Pearl Harbor. We have, in the last 15 years, largely recovered from 9/11. But if some outside actor, Russia, for example, Vladimir Putin's Russia, were successful to discredit and cast doubt, cause sufficient doubt, loss of confidence by us, the American voters, in our democratic process, I think the damage done there would be much more severe than the physical damage of even something as tragic as Pearl Harbor or 9/11. Now, why do I say that? I think there are 5 reasons that this is a national security issue. Let me just quickly tick through these and then we'll proceed with the program. First of all, this is a national security issue because Putin has demonstrated that he can do this. As a military officer, I'm trained that a threat is a combination of a capability and an intent. So the capability to do harm and the intent to do so. Well, this is pretty well demonstrated that last year he had the capability to disrupt, and he clearly had the intent to do so. So by even military, classic military definition, this is a national security threat. So it's proven incredible. We would never accept this degree of vulnerability, given a threat, given a known threat, and any of our other traditional national security systems. Imagine this degree of vulnerability in our nuclear weapons security system, or in our intelligence, surveillance, or reconnaissance systems, in our key intelligence systems, in our command and control systems, the systems that send our sons and daughters into harm's way, into our targeting system. We'd never accept this kind of vulnerability. And yet we're living today with the kind of vulnerability that saw Russia play out this threat last year. Second, this is a national security threat because Russia is not going away. This is not a one-shot deal. Putin will run for office again in March of next year. That's easy. He'll be in office another 6 years after that. So that takes him all the way to 2024. It just gives him 6 more years to figure out how to stay in office beyond 2024. even if Putin were to die of a heart attack, or, he rides around and chases tigers and bears and so forth, even if he had a tragic accident of some sort, the Russian leader who would replace Vladimir Putin would look in substance a lot like Vladimir Putin. That has to do with the national security interests of Russia today. I think Russia learned a lot last year in what really, I think, can be seen as a series of probing attacks. So this was not a very sophisticated effort last year. I think they were probably shocked at how vulnerable we are and how easy this was, right? And I also think they learned that with a little more sophistication and a little more targeted effort, they could really do something that we don't have evidence that they did last year, which is affect the outcome, right? So I think we should expect that they learned and that they're going to come back in a much more sophisticated way. Number 3. This is a national security issue because Russia's not the only external player who would do us harm. Think of Iran, think of North Korea, think of even non-national, subnational groups like the so-called Islamic State. And there may be others. There may be disaffected domestic groups that would wish to influence even local or state elections. Number 4, this is a national security issue because time is short. The 2018 elections are less than a year from now. So we can talk about this between now and the 2018 elections, and that time will go very fast. 2020 is just around the corner from 2018. So time is short. We've got to have a sense of urgency about this, about the kind of vulnerabilities that you're about to hear, and try to do something as much as we can in the next few months. And finally, this is a national security issue because the U.S. is not the only democracy that's vulnerable in this way. All of our key allies in Asia, in Europe, and elsewhere rely on the fundamental connection between the voter and the voting outcome. That is the ballot, the vote, right, as the foundation of their democracies. All of our key allies are democracies. So it's not just our democracy that's vulnerable here. All of our key partners are vulnerable as well. So look, for all of these reasons, I think that it's worthy to come out today on a cold Chicago day and reveal what we know about what happened last year. I am not the expert in the room on the voting process. I mean, NOAA certainly is here locally. We have national experts here in the room in terms of how America conducts its votes. For about 40 years, I voted by absentee ballot because I was stationed all over the world in, godforsaken places, and that was the only way to vote. But I always assumed when I voted by absentee ballot and stuffed the ballot inside the envelope, signed the back of the envelope, and mailed it, that it then became somebody else's job to ensure that my vote would count. After watching what happened last year, I don't feel that way anymore. And that is for somebody who's committed my adult life to trying in a small way to contribute to national security, is why I'm upset about this and why this really, for me, has imparted a sense of urgency to try to be a part of fixing this. So look, I want to turn now to Sean, our DHS official, and you'll appreciate that DHS across the federal government is the department that has primary responsibility for critical infrastructure, and that this, our election system, is one of those fundamentals, one of those sectors of critical infrastructure. So, Sean.
Thanks, Ambassador Lute. Thanks, Jake. I'd also like to thank the Harris School for inviting us here to the International House today. Like the Ambassador mentioned, it's always good to get outside the Beltway, and this is a great opportunity to speak about what I've been working on for the past 2 months solid straight about election infrastructure. So just wanted to make a clarifying point. Expert, such an ugly word, but we deal with all 16 critical infrastructure sectors at DHS. And I work in the National Protection and Programs Division within DHS, and specifically I work in the Cybersecurity and Communications Division. So I'm a cyber guy by trade. Really kind of talking about some of the things today, I wanted to update you on what we're doing as DHS to assist election infrastructure and election officials like NOAA on how to secure their systems. So to do that, I kind of want to talk about kind of what's happened over the past year that kind of have been driving that role. So in January of 2017, then DHS Secretary Johnson designated election infrastructure as a critical infrastructure subsector within the overall government facilities sector. So what does that mean? Really for us, for DHS, that means that it really formalizes the way that we can support the sector. It designates us, DHS, as a sector-specific agency responsible for supporting that subsector. I later learned that this designation kind of caused a little bit of angst amongst our state and local partners in the election world. I can assure you, DHS is not here to take over elections. We are simply here to support. Our primary job is to support critical infrastructure now, which election infrastructure is part of. So that was in January of 2017. In October of this year, DHS, in partnership with the Election Assistance Commission, the National Association of Secretaries of State, and state and local officials from across the country convened the first Government Coordinating Council for Election Infrastructure, which really kind of laid a foundation for the partnership between federal entities like DHS and state and local election officials. I kind of want to reiterate that this, from a DHS perspective, especially particularly from a cybersecurity perspective, we work regularly with finance. We work regularly with some of the other critical infrastructure, water, electricity. We understand that election infrastructure is a new relationship for us. And over the past several months, we've been working through the GCC, organizations like NAS, and with election professionals like NOAA to kind of increase our understanding of the challenges that they face and really glean an understanding of election infrastructure nationwide from them. Okay, so really aside from the GCC and the designation as critical infrastructure, what else have we been doing as DHS? Early on, we realized after the GCC convened that we needed a central point within DHS to assist election infrastructure. DHS is a big organization, particularly cybersecurity and communications is a big organization, and we needed a central touch point within our organization for election infrastructure. So DHS created the Election Task Force, which resides within cybersecurity and communications at DHS. Some of the memberships of that organization are internal, our intelligence and analysis teams, our protective security advisor teams, which are fielded throughout the country, our cybersecurity advisor teams, which I'm responsible for, our National Cybersecurity Communications and Integration Center, which is our national level incident response capability. They're part of the Election Task Force. Other federal agencies are part of the Election Task Force to coordinate outreach and support. So the task force really centralizes our support there within DHS, and it really has three primary goals. The first is obviously, I kind of touched on this already, was to characterize risk to election infrastructure. That's going to assist us in understanding the problem, planning for resources, and then also in prioritization of our efforts. The second goal is really to provide services to state and local election officials. And by services, I mean things like cyber and physical security assessments, information sharing, incident response, and training resources. So those are kind of some of the services that we offer. And then lastly, through the GCC and as the sector-specific agency, one of our goals of the task force is to mature the GCC and formalize the nature in which we support them, as well as conduct an outreach to the over, 6,000 different election officials across the country. I would like to take this time to mention our field forces. So one of the challenges at the task force faces is that it's inside the Beltway, right? So NPPD, or National Protection Programs Division, has field forces. I mentioned a little bit earlier. We have really three different components to our field forces. We have our regional offices, which are 10 different regional offices in all 10 FEMA regions throughout the country. And those are led by a regional director. And then we have protective security advisors that I mentioned before. Those are physical security experts that can conduct assessments on physical locations within the election infrastructure, And then lastly, cybersecurity advisors, which I'm responsible for. So right now we have 12 cybersecurity advisors throughout the country, soon to be 24. And part of their jobs is to develop relationships at the local level with state, city, and county officials in order to protect critical infrastructure of which elections is part of. They conduct assessments there on the spot, as well as have reach-back capability for some of our more technical assessments back at Cybersecurity and Communications. And then in conclusion, just of my comments here, we understand, election infrastructure is a top priority for us. Really since the 1st of October, I have been doing nothing but thinking about election infrastructure, working with election officials, and working on this problem. We understand that the critical nature of confidence that the voter has in the system, I think that's the key piece to all this. Even the perception of attack can be worse than an attack itself, depending on the situation. And you're really going to hear some good comments from Noah about some of the challenges that our state and local officials face as they work to secure our systems. So thank you very much. I'll bring up Noah.
Good afternoon, everyone. All right. So my name's Noah Prates. I'm the Director of Elections here in Cook County. I work for David Orr. Are you here, David? Well, he's our county clerk, right? He's been a visionary, a visionary protecting voters' rights, but now he's a driver in election security. I'm not a security expert. I'm a lawyer and a paranoid public servant. I think we can make elections more secure with some relatively modest investments. As you've heard today, there's reason to be paranoid. You heard it a few minutes ago, and you've heard it for the last year from the entire national security establishment. Threats to our infrastructure are real. Foreign governments, foreign non-state actors, and domestic troublemakers have the capacity and the desire to erode the essential public belief that our outcomes are true and reliable. To different degrees, this threat exists both to unofficial results posted on election night and seemingly to official final results, though that's much more difficult nut to crack. But certainly it exists to the variety of systems that we use to run seamless elections. Local election officials, people like me, and there are nearly 9,000 of us in the country, we're the shock troops on this new battlefield. We need resources, and funders must act now to ensure election security. This is not about 2016 for me. We're presenting a clear-eyed view of what's needed to protect us down the road. Our white paper, which is available out there, is called 2020 Vision. First, I want to underline, local election officials are serving valiantly. They've held the line against attacks. And they'll tell you to a person, like any good troop, that they'll continue to hold the line. But I'm here to say today that in fact the resources are too few, and in many places the burden's too great. Election officials need assistance. So cybersecurity, this is one more sword to juggle for us election officials. We used to be just logistics and managers, getting people and things to one place on one day and effectuating an election perfectly. Much like the military has to operate, get it right the first time. But after 2000 and Bush v. Gore, we had to become IT and legal compliance managers. And now, we also must be cybersecurity managers. So a quick lay of the land. The federal government, aside from recent assistance, plays almost no role in elections. State election officials are responsible for a portion of the elections infrastructure, statewide voter registration lists primarily, though in a couple places they display election results on election night or manage data files necessary to operate election equipment. However, 9,000 local election officials control everything else. This includes managing, storing, and protecting voting machines and vote counting systems, including all hardware and software, electronic and paper poll books, voter registration and election management systems, websites with voter tools and public information, and other subsystems like geographic information systems, ballot printing systems, vote-by-mail preparation and processing systems, military voting systems, and a variety of essential election support systems like Election Day command centers. Each of these systems, by the nature of systems everywhere, are replete with vulnerabilities which, if attacked, can damage the election itself and diminish public confidence. So in light of this new threat, we have a new mission, a new mantra: defend, detect, recover. We know that security cannot be about defense alone. Inevitably, some attacks will get through. Think about Equifax or Uber, HBO, Target, the Office of Personnel Management, the federal government. So because defense is difficult or even impossible, the challenge of security is to ensure that no attack exceeds our resilience or our ability to detect and recover from it. Whether that means restoring lost data or even recounting ballots by hand to establish election results that are trusted and true. Hence our mantra, defend, detect, recover. Each state, to be sure, has a different security matrix in which officials operate. A particular mix of skill, technology, and policy that affect their ability to defend, detect, and recover. States with great audits, detection capacity, right? And paper ballots, recovery capacity, well, they're much more resilient by definition, and therefore their burden of defending their systems is much lower. On the other hand, states without good audits and without paper ballots place the unenviable burden on their local election officials of being perfect defenders every single time. That's not a fair burden. So our 2020 vision outlines a challenging yet achievable list of actions to protect the integrity of these multiple systems. It's painful, expensive, and aspirational at this point, but the protection of our most foundational institution, elections, requires a sacrifice. So first, government funders and policymakers need to relieve the burden on locals by doing three sets of things. One, for recovery. For recovery, they need to eliminate even the remotest possibility of undetectable catastrophic breach by replacing all paperless voting systems that currently serve nearly 20% of the country. Relieve election officials from their burden of being perfect every time. Two, for detection. Funders need to increase detection capability by incentivizing the use of modern public audits, the use of modern voting technology that captures a digital ballot image that can be tied to the original and to the cast vote record, and to install or support the installation of monitoring sensors on the networks of all willing election officials. Look, new technology and new policy will make catastrophic worst-case scenarios disappear. So three, for defense. Funders must support a digital network of all local election officials that will facilitate the rapid sharing of threat information and incidents, and also support increased training and resiliency. Homeland Security has been helpful moving along on that front. Funders must also finance an election infrastructure and information security officer to serve every local election official in this country. And they must ensure that threat and incident information that they're privy to are shared rapidly and appropriately throughout the election system, something that was not handled particularly well after 2016. Look, the variety of systems that we rely on to manage elections are by their nature replete with vulnerabilities that will always remain. Because of that, investment in the defensive capacity of local election officials is absolutely critical. Catastrophe can be avoided with new tech and policy, but localized chaos, well, that can be contained only with skill. Financial support for skilled workers will limit catastrophe and chaos. Now, once funders and policymakers have done their job, relieve the burden on local election officials, of being perfect every time, local officials should consider taking the following steps in partnership with their election infrastructure and information security officer. For defense, we need to get experts into our offices. Most election officials and offices cannot handle this problem on their own. There simply is not the capacity to accept the threat, assess the vulnerability, digest recommendations, manage mitigations, and perfect recovery. We share our internal IT and security resources oftentimes with every other county office, fire, police, health. We need dedicated attention. We need to utilize as many of the tools that are offered by the federal government in places like the Center for Internet Security, conduct vulnerability assessments and hygiene scans. We also need to limit the threat surface area, or the number of points of vulnerability that we have in our systems. We do this by keeping an inventory of each of the systems, and I listed about 14 of them a few minutes ago. Map them out, every piece of hardware, every way that every bit of data flows. Each of those are marked as a point of vulnerability. And at each point, map out how we defend, detect, and recover from breach. We need to make policy decisions that will limit the threat surface area. Now, this is risk management. It's not risk elimination. There are always trade-offs. You open up a new risk by limiting another one. But we need to go into this process with our eyes wide open to the threats that are now upon us. We need to employ defense tactics for all of our systems, whether online or not. The Center for Internet Security offers a great starting point. We should implement the top 20 cyber controls. These include things like continuous vulnerability assessments and remediation, controlled use of administrative privileges based on the need to know, security skills assessments and appropriate training to fill gaps, incident response, management, penetration testing, and red team exercises. And finally, we need to employ system-specific defenses and detection tactics that we've been doing really well for many years, hardening our systems, fully utilizing locks and seals, robust authentication, and instituting strong chain of custody documentation and practices. Now, for detection, election officials should consider a method of detecting at each vulnerability point whether or not something has happened. Go back to the mapping process. We need to validate everything. Each log, seal, timesheet, camera, swipe card, data file. It's not enough to simply keep logs. That's good for after action, but timely detection is critical. We should implement behavioral analytics. For example, voter registration follows a natural pattern, year over year, month over month, day over day, hour over hour, person by person. Identifying that pattern, patterns like it, and watching for anomalous behavior is a great tipping point. We should use forensics wherever possible. A forensic analysis of the software system can offer a high level of confidence that it's operating as certified, with no nefarious software code. Comparing digital snapshots or hashes of used software with a clean reference copy while managing an election is a powerful verification and proof technique, one that I think we alone in Cook County engage in. And most importantly, we should conduct public audits of the election results that allow for a visual comparison of the cast ballot record to the ballot itself. We should strive to be transparent, but we'll need to brace ourselves for public scrutiny. While crowdsourcing brings the greatest confidence, it also brings the greatest scrutiny. Sausage making will be on full display. We should consider publishing ballot images once scrubbed of identifying marks. And we should continue to study and push audits that bring high confidence to the broadest number of stakeholders. A recent example of this innovation in practice is the use of efficient testing algorithms like risk-limiting audits. And for recovery, we should assume a successful breach and detection of breach and determine how to recover. This exercise alone will create a disaster recovery and incident response plan that we can be ready to turn to when we need it. Where possible, we need to make policy decisions and investment that yield the clearest path to recovery. So beyond removing the burden of paperless voting systems, consider that ballot marking devices are better than machines with paper audit trails, that digital scanning devices that create images of ballots are better than scanning devices that don't. We need to employ redundancy that doesn't rely on technology. Paper poll books, backup electronic poll books. Emergency ballots, backup corrupted or just malfunctioning touchscreens or scanning devices. And we need to practice recovery with our professionals, our advisors, and our vendors by running drills and exercises. Theory is just that. Practice makes it real. In closing, local election officials are serving valiantly. They've held the line, but to continue to do so in light of the new threat, we really need support. It must be underlined, the 9,000 of us are the frontline troops in this battle. Those who control federal, state, and local spending must provide local election officials with resources to do their jobs in this environment. Those who drive state election policies must make choices to fortify local election officials for their new cyber mission. Here's the bottom line. It is impossible to defend against every conceivable attack every single time. But if we detect breaches and we recover from them quickly, we can survive, and so will our faith in American democracy. Thank you. Oh, you can. Is everybody?
Again, I'm Frank Taylor. I'm the former Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security. I retired from the department in January of 2017. I've spent my entire career, both in the military and in government and in the private sector, in some form of security, crisis management, or risk assessment. And I'm not going to reiterate what our panelists or our speakers have spoken to this morning. I have 2 points. The first point is, as with 9/11, this is a real, clear, and present danger to our country. And we need to recognize it as such. It's not a political foil. It is real, and it's coming again. And as we have done with 9/11, the real secret sauce of responding from 9/11 has been how our government has organized itself to help the people who are on the front lines that Noah just described to implement best practices for resilience going forward. That's the solution to the future. It takes resources, it takes process, and it takes the frontline folks understanding that it's in their hands with the federal government's assistance. And as my colleague Doug Lute mentioned, this is not going away. 2018 is 10 months away. By the way, interfering in elections has been around for a long time. The thing that's made this much more significant is the ease with which someone can sit on the other side of the world and do dastardly things within our environment. Phil Agee wrote a book in the 1960s about U.S. operations in Latin America around the same, but he had to be on the ground. He had to recruit sources. He had to do other things. That's not necessary today. So that is where we sit. So I'd like to start our panel discussion today. And I think Jake and Harry and the group at DEF CON did a magnificent job. So I wanted Harry and Doug to talk a little bit about the Voter Village, what you were trying to accomplish, and what do you think we learned from the Voter Village at DEF CON this year?
Let me just say, first of all, what is this thing, DEF CON? Sorry, how do you turn this mic on? This is about the limit of my technical expertise. So look, 6 months ago, I'd never heard of this thing. I mean, I imagine hackers were like motorcycle gangs, sorry, Hari, okay, but there's some sector of the society out there, and sure there were people who wanted to do this, but I never imagined I'd meet one or have anything to do with one. Well, it turns out this organization called DEF CON sponsors every year the largest conference of this particular gang, the hackers, and their numbers are in like 25,000 members. And they all convene, and they take on cybersecurity challenges. So this year, in the past, they've done autonomous vehicles and so forth. This year in July, they took on this question of electronic connections as part of the voting process. And Hari was at the center of that, so I'll turn down to Hari. But that's what DEF CON is. And this year's DEF CON took on the voting village as a challenge. And Hari, I'll turn to you in terms of results.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, DEF CON is one of the oldest and one of the largest. It's not still unique. There are similar things around the world, even in Russia. And actually, some of the bigger ones are in Southeast Asia. So this is not a one-off. There is a lot of these. Some are more underground, some are less underground. There's a wonderful thing called HOPE, Hackers on Planet Earth, which is every second or third year in New York, slightly more underground. Anyway, so these kind of events are everywhere. When we set up the village, this was not a hackathon. This was not to prove the machines can be hacked. We had well established every single machine we had there has been hacked and is hackable. However, there was a few elements which are unique. It has been very, very small group of privileged people like myself who has been examining voting machines. There have been a different kind of burdens, legal burdens and legal threats, which have limited who can touch the machines and who cannot. Obviously, a real criminal wouldn't care about the DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act, if they break a copyright while they are doing their crime. But as a security researchers, that is a real threat to us. So what happened was a U.S. Copyright Office has a triennial review of DMCA. We wrote a paper, a couple of groups actually simultaneously and parallel wrote a paper, and we got an exempt for voting machines research in DMCA. So that made it possible for us to have the village. The other thing is eBay. We just bought all the machines from eBay. And that's another point where the mantra has been no one gets access to these machines. No, that's not true. The question was, are you going to be threatened by copyright? But the access is eBay. You just go and buy them. We actually went to one of the places that was in Ohio. They still have 1,300 unsold machines, and there are some machines which are still in use. Again, another scary lesson is that jurisdictions who have the same machine are buying it from them and putting them in use, which means that there's no chain of custody whatsoever. Now, the current rebuttal for the previous studies have been, obviously, if you spend a few weeks of trying to hack, you can hack it. Well, first of all, if you would be nation state, you probably have a few weeks too. So the argument is wrong. But the other thing is that in the previous studies, we have had restrictions which are not real for criminals, but they are the ones which actually caused us to take time, weeks. Now, when we didn't have those restrictions in place, we had the first 2 machines fall under 2 hours by people who had never seen the machines before, didn't know how to prepare. They didn't even have the tools because they didn't know what tools to bring. So the first hours were just people tweeting and asking, do you have that? I need that. And people were carrying stuff around the grounds, helping people who are trying to do the hack to have the proper tools. So I think the most important thing was the education. First of all, what really made me feel good is how many election officials were hacking the machines they use in their daily elections. This was the first time when technologically and technically savvy election officials were having the opportunity to tinker and to study the machines they use in their everyday election business. I was just really delightful. Also, we had a lot of election officials who have been technologically savvy, but not anymore. They were just wanting to be there, just experience it, just see it. And when somebody finds something, come to see with their own eyes. Instead of reading from newspaper, they are vulnerable. Now you can see how it works. And so many times people said, no, it cannot be this simple. I say, yep, that's how simple it is. That was the shock. That was the... So, in a nutshell, this was all about education. This was about arming people with facts, arming people with the ability to study themselves, arming people with the first-hand experience. And as an outcome, one of the things we didn't do in DEF CON, but was our outcome of that, because we had one machine which had been recently decertified. It shouldn't be in use. It might be still in use somewhere, but it shouldn't. It's a wonderful piece because with that voting machine, which was decertified 2015 and had been used in election 2015 in multiple states, you can see a recent technology and you can experiment with that, do demonstrations without ever being accused you're helping the criminals, because that machine shouldn't be in use. One feature of that machine is that the voter can reach and open live hot ports. So we did develop an attack, which is simply this. The voter plugs this behind a machine and the attack is carried out. No knowledge needed. And this is how to demonstrate how if we don't secure the infrastructure, if we don't take the responsible way of using technology, this is how easy it is for those guys who are capable of putting hands on the ground. And the same machine was the one which was also hacked wirelessly. You don't need to be in a building. You can be in a parking lot. You can be in the next building.
Harry scares a lot of us when he talks. So
you can be in Moscow.
Indeed. Yeah. And speaking of that, Sherri Ramsay ran both offense and defense for the National Security Agency. And Sherri, maybe a couple of comments from your perspective on the nature of the threat and why it's important for us to be thinking about this today.
Sure. So when we talk about events like this, there's three things we need to focus on. The first is the target itself. Is there something that anybody's interested in? And of course, these days, it seems like that list is very short of the things that somebody's not interested in, right? They're interested in even our blood types and our social security numbers. And certainly, as we have seen, they're interested in our voting apparatus. One piece of which is the voting machines, which is what we're actually focused on today. But just understand, the voting machines are just one piece. There's still there's voter registration databases. There's all kinds of things that could be taken advantage of. But certainly, we've seen interest in the voting machines. Then the question is there anybody who's interested in it? Do they have the ability? Do they have the motivation? And do they have the resources to go out and try to launch an attack on this particular target, in this case, the voting machines? Again, I think we've seen in spades, yes, there's at least one actor. My guess is there's lots of others, actually, who were eagerly watching and to see what happens. And my guess is we're going to have probably a much more difficult time next time with many more interested parties. And then the last thing is it feasible to do? You know, there can be interest, there can be actors that are interested in a particular entity, but if there's not a feasible way they can carry this out, then, you know, we feel pretty good. And so I think in the past, everyone has assumed, hey, the voting machines are safe. It's not feasible to attack them. Why? Because there are lots of different kinds. It's hard to even find out. We thought it was hard to get our hands on them. It's hard to find out who uses what. It's a very distributed, I won't even say it's an architecture, it's just a very distributed set of machines. Each state and county does their own thing and reports back in different ways. And so people said, oh no, it's just not feasible to carry out a mass attack on these voting machines. And I would like to, I'm not saying this was done or that it will be done, but I'd like to just kind of briefly point out a way that it could be done to demonstrate that it's feasible. Today, as we all know, we live in the world that's a global marketplace. Everything, I think we would be hard-pressed to go and buy anything that's strictly made in the U.S. And even if it's just made in the U.S., I don't think we could count on it being pure. But because it is a global marketplace and economics mean everything, we generally go to where it's cheapest to make things, which means lots of things are made outside of the U.S. In particular, hardware for computers and software, lots of it, in fact, almost all of it, is probably made outside of the U.S. So if you just look at hardware, we're talking about little chips, and they're made all over the world, primarily outside of the U.S. And if you look at these voting machines, what are they if we really boil down to it? They're really computers. And so they're made of tons of these chips, which are made everywhere. There's really, not only is there not probably our kind of quality control on the chips, but who's to say, somebody doesn't have access to these chips and puts extra capabilities in these chips that then get sold and put in our voting machines. So you might say, okay, well, if we buy the voting machines new, then that's the only time those chips could be put in, and we don't buy them new all the time, so that's really not feasible. Well, so actually that can happen when they're new. So over time, we could get huge numbers of voting machines with these bad chips in them. But hardware maintenance does occur. So using that venue, there could be interesting chips put in there. But then let's take a look at the software. The software is almost all developed overseas as well. So there could be an insider threat who actually puts a piece of a gift or a capability that we're not expected inside the software as it's being developed. And therefore, it's in there from the very beginning. I mean, you don't have to put it in. It is developed in there. What if they can't recruit a software developer to do that? Well, then actually, a hacker can actually remotely attack the software development facility itself, get onto the development network, and that way put a gift in. And then you say, okay, well, what are we going to do now that we've got this capability in the software? Well, I think NOAA and other election officials will attest that every time there's an election, guess what? There's a download of software, of data, into each voting machine, because every election is different. The data that goes in there is different. So there is a download to each machine. And by the way, that download is trusted, right? Because you do it. And so there's that opportunity, and regardless of where the machine is, what kind of machine it is, there's that trusted software download into the machine. And then actually we've sort of, just by pure economics, we've sort of done it to ourselves. There used to be like 20 different companies that made voting machines. And you might say, well, that's really hard to go after 20 different brands of machines, all of whom use proprietary software and hardware, all of whom are different. But sort of just through a natural selection over the last 5 or 10 years, mergers, people going out of business, we're now down to 3 or 4 companies who make voting machines. So just economies have narrowed down the scope of the target. So I think, not to say that this did happen or that it will happen next time, but I think I've certainly laid out several viable options for doing kind of some kind of, either we can download and affect the election by this mass event against a number of voting machines. And it is absolutely doable. And in fact, it's not even really that difficult to do.
We actually didn't bring Hari and Sherri here to scare you. But we wanted to really tee up the issue from a threat perspective. It's important, I think Noah raised it, it's not just about voting machines, it's the totality of the system, voter registration systems, polling systems, all those things that come together to produce the elections in our country. And so I wanted to ask one more question, then I'm going to turn it over to Jake for your questions from the audience. And the question is to Sean and Noah about the challenge ahead of you and how you all see this unfolding in the course of the next 6, 9, 12 months and into the future as you build your partnerships with both Sean from a DHS perspective and Noah as you're working with your colleagues across the country. I think your white paper is a start from a best practice perspective, but where do we go from here?
My technical abilities are limited here too, I think. Okay. That's a good question. I think, and Noah mentioned the 9,000 plus election officials I got 3,000 more people I have to reach out to now, thanks. But that is a big challenge nationwide. I think if you talk to some of the state election officials, I think at the state level there's certain infrastructure that's in place that's common, it's fairly common across several states, but the challenge is at the county level, and that's where the yeoman's work is really done, as Noah mentioned. I think from our perspective, we're starting at the top with the Government Coordinating Council from a DHS perspective, and that's a good place to start. But the challenge is going forward in the next year is really going to be how do we translate some of those services, some of those practices that Noah mentioned down to the county level through the states. And Noah mentioned the security controls. I think there's a lot of things at the federal level that map to that, like the NIST cybersecurity framework, for example. All of our assessments at DHS are mapped to the NIST framework, so they tie in nicely to the controls from CIS. But getting those best practices down to the state or down to the county level is going to be the challenge. And Noah had really hit the nail on the head when he talked about shared IT services at the county level and at the city level, where maybe one IT professional has responsibility for all critical functions, emergency management, et cetera, within that county. And there are standards and practices that they're beholden to as well. So it is a challenge. So actually increasing their capacity is kind of where I think we need to focus. And we do that through training and education, and like Noah mentioned, additional funding. That's going to have to come through the congressional level.
Yeah, I think broadly that's right. One of the conditions precedent to moving forward is to get the entire ecosystem to accept the premise, right? And so, unfortunately, there's a little bit of this that's tied up with the past, with the 2016 election and politics. And there's some thought in the community that this is a low probability risk and that it might be a political effort to undermine a presidency, right? And so what we need to do is we've got to get past that and accept the premise. And even if that's going on, somebody is still attacking Equifax and Uber and HBO, and that if you accept that premise, then we need to go on to the next step, which is how do we how do we cover down for the worst case scenario? Because it's not particularly expensive when you look at the scope of the money that this country spends to defend its institutions. And so once the premise is accepted, and that's a huge challenge, then we can start wrapping our head around the scope. And the scope is really to accept that the 9,000 local election officials bear the overwhelming majority of the risk and need support. So it's a two-step process.
Excellent. I'm going to ask Jake to come forward to lead the Q&A.
All right, thanks. So I will just take questions from the audience. So yes, go ahead. And we've got roamers with microphones.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and doing the work that you're doing. One question that I had, I think that from the last election, something that's at top of mind is the weaponization of social media and the impact on elections through that. Given that a lot of the social media is of private companies, what are y'all thinking about that challenge and the best practices that y'all are putting out? How do you address that issue?
Certainly social media has exploded literally into every aspect of our life, and I'm really quite excited about how organizations like Facebook and Google and Twitter are accepting the responsibility for how their platforms are being used. You've seen some of that discussion in the Hill investigations into the 2016 election. I think that's going to continue. There's increasing international pressure for them to monitor more closely the use of their platforms for nefarious or inappropriate things, and I think you'll see them invest more and more money in that regard. It's It's difficult for them from a business model perspective because they don't want to be seen as an information business. They want to be seen as a technology business, which gives them a lot more business latitude, but increasingly it's hard for those organizations to not kind of meet at the crossroads between information technology and the fact that they are producing information and data that's being consumed in certain ways across the world, and that they have some responsibility for what gets put on their platform.
I think this problem is one that where we actually really need to form a team like we've never done before, maybe back in the 60s when we were trying to put man on the moon. But it really needs to be an effort not where industry distrusts the government and government is viewed as trying to get into industry, but we really have to all recognize that the networks are owned by everyone and all of us. Nobody, and so therefore it's got to be everybody's responsibility for protecting them and the data that goes on those networks. And so I think what we have to really try to, as we go forward and we look at policy and law, which haven't been changed in a long time, we really need to figure out how do we work together, in ways that can be accepted that we can, where the government has a role to play and plays that role. Industry has a role to play and plays that role, and academia has a role to play and plays that role, and we all have to collaborate and talk together as a team to really make this happen. I actually don't have a blueprint for how to make that happen, but I think fora like this actually help us recognize that that is something that absolutely needs to happen. I think each and every one of you, when you go around and talk to people, you need to be thinking about that. And if you agree with that, make that point that we really have to find ways to work together. And everybody has responsibility here. And it's not just for the voting process and the voting machines. It's really, because I think all of us like sitting in this room with heat on and electricity on. We all liked having lunch. So, networks really govern our lives in terms of our banks, our heating, our electricity, every single thing that we do. And yet we all have to find out how to play this role and play it together. And we're not there yet, and we really have to focus on that as well.
Yeah, let me just emphasize that from our perspective, this is not a partisan issue. This is an American issue. I mean, I don't even know the party affiliation of the other panelists up here. And frankly, it's not my business. I don't care. This is an American national security interest. And we should treat it like the way we treat other major national security issues, which is on a bipartisan, all-of-government, all-American approach. So this is not about partisan politics.
One thing which also is important, sometimes it's easier to look somewhere else than something which is too close to home. The psyops in social media are global. Maybe pick another country and look what happens there. Who are influenced? What are the mechanisms? Now it's not close to home, and now you can be an analytical and objective.
Absolutely. I do think while this group is not focused on fake news and stuff like that per se, one of the things that we are all looking at an ongoing basis is if this is a broad influence campaign that's being waged from Facebook all the way through to election results, how are we trying to think about how to secure the election from that perspective? So that means that while we're concerned about people potentially flipping votes in voting machines, what we're also really concerned about is can they hack the website where they release election results, and could they just cause chaos on election day by doing that? Can they mess with the voter registration dates and delete a bunch of people or switch their addresses so nobody knows where to vote on election day and cause chaos that way? And that's very much in line with what they're doing on Facebook and Twitter and so on. And so in that respect, I think that this group is kind of focused on that piece of the problem. Do we have another question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Lori McPhillips. I'm actually running for Will County Clerk in the upcoming election. And one of the questions I have, it's a two-part question, is how would you prioritize the recommendations today? And also, having spent 25 years in budgeting in the county without full funding, what kind of things could be implemented on existing funds?
I'll go to Noah on that.
Yeah, it's a tough thing because this is, an aspirational document that we're working towards. Clearly, with the internet, or the CIS top 20 controls, I think that was designed to go in order, kind of from easiest and biggest bang for the buck down to the hardest. So the top 5 of those, I think, have been recommended as a good way to prioritize. And then with respect to the budgeting, you know, we face the same concerns that you do. Neighbor, right? So part of it is making room, I think, in places like this, where we're able to discuss the threat and acknowledge the vulnerability. I mean, I want to underline that our voters should all believe, as I do 100%, that we're running secure elections in the United States. And it's a question of probability to me, and the probability of attack is going up significantly, and in light of that, we can invest to make the change. But yeah, we're going to have to acknowledge that there are some potential weaknesses in the operations and ask for help.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. I mentioned the Cybersecurity Advisor Program, so there's a lot of free services that DHS offers in the name of training through our Fed VTE program, which is a virtual training environment that state and local officials can take advantage of with their IT folks. Also, constant and continuous assessment and evaluation of systems of where they are. That can be done with a lot of times with the existing resources that we can provide free of charge. So taking advantage of some of those resources, and we've been happy to talk to you offline if you want to about where you can obtain some of those and how we can put you in touch with somebody who can help.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I would just say that doing nothing is not an option. Doing something, getting started, because it won't happen overnight. It happens over time. But it's a daunting challenge, but not sitting back and saying, well, there's nothing I can do about it, but there are things you can begin to do in your systems to begin to create resiliency. And so to the extent resources are available, expertise is available. On the counterterrorism side, we share best practices across all 18,000 police organizations across this country every day. And I see this being another one of those areas where that kind of information sharing, best practices, really gets ideas into your head that aren't expensive but are effective in getting better resilience in your systems.
Hari, in my mind, two of the most important things in NOAA's plan is the paper ballots and the risk limiting audits. Do you maybe want to talk about why those are the perfect foil for a hacker?
So first of all, I would like to say that one important thing to understand that the attacker's mind is different than defender's mind. Attacker is not caring about style points. So if attacker wants to attack a state, he or she will choose the weakest counties. So you cannot say that county is not important because we are all together. So you always look for the weakest place. You use the diversity of systems by using the weakest system. So the diversity, which is always thought that that's an advantage, it's disadvantage because it gives more opportunities to attackers. But very important part is really going to a evidence-based voting, an evidence-based system. So paper ballot, where the voter's intent is recorded to permanent media. Legislation which allows an audit, and there's a number of different ways of audit, depending which kind of jurisdiction it is, what is the local statute, but having statutes which enable you to do an audit, whether it's a full audit, whether it's a risk-limiting audit. Risk-limiting audit is an audit which doesn't verify the result, it verifies that the winner is the right one. So it might be 1,000 votes off, but still it doesn't change the winner. So that's what risk-limiting audit, if you want to put it like oversimplify by order of magnitude, that's what it is. Always, you have to assume that any system, the system used in 2030, it's still going to be vulnerable. While you secure the system, and that's important, really what you want to secure is the results. And you have the results every single day. Every election is different. You have to have a mechanism to audit the results. And also, my argument there is that if you say you automatically audit when the margin of victory is 10%, that is a hint for attacker. I want the difference to be 11%. So audit always. Audit when you are absolutely certain it's 80-20. Then it's very easy to audit because it's so blatantly obvious from just scratching the surface, is this a right result or not? So mandatory audits, which doesn't require to be called by winner or loser or just mandatory audit of the results.
Yeah, let me just add one other point to that. So get the machines off the internet. That's what we proved in Las Vegas, right? Number two, back up the voting process itself by way of auditing, which means that you start with paper, which sounds crazy, doesn't it? I mean, we're in the 21st century, and we're essentially saying the best practice here is to go back to paper. Well, guess what? Most of our key allies around the world, other key democracies, are all on paper. So the Dutch, the Germans, the Brits all use paper. And then the third thing I would add to that list, so get off the internet, audits. The third thing is secure the databases, the registration databases, because if those are insecure and have been compromised, the voter doesn't even get to the ballot, right? Because his middle initial is compromised, or 2 figures in his street address is changed. So now the ID card, typically the driver's license, doesn't match the poll book at the door of the ballot place, of the voting place, right? And the voter is turned away. So what I'm worried about is that the 20 states whose registration databases were probed, not compromised, but probed last year, right? That will appear to any nation state wishing to affect American elections on a big scale as the soft target, right? So you don't actually have to hack the machine. Just get to the database, the voter registration databases. That's a severe vulnerability, and there are things we can do today before November 2018 to secure those databases. That's just good practice. That's just common sense.
Okay, any more questions? Yes, right there. She's coming back around with the microphone.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this forum. I'm a polling place coordinator here in this state. There is paper in addressing the issue that you've been about flipping names, deleting people, and all the rest of that. Everyone who came to my polling place got through the door, and they voted. Now, the paper is very labor-intensive, and when I start out, I have to decrement all the counters to 0, and then when I transmit, I actually keep a tape. It's an aggregate tape. I don't know who votes individually, but we need help. No question, we need help. And anyone who's willing to do what I do comes early and stays late. There are a lot of very committed people who are willing to do that. But anything that can be made available, people are willing to do that.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes, sir. Here. She's coming around with the mic.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for thinking about this very broadly. Obviously, you've been thinking about it for a long time. All the vulnerabilities, starting from social media, people trying to change people's opinions even before they get to the polling place. And I guess I just want to say I'm happy and surprised to hear that paper is still the most secure or part of a secure system, and I don't mind using that at all. Just a note. I remember, I think it was 1960, watching the national election results on TV and watching the numbers go up on the board, one vote at a time, adding up to the millions. And I wondered then how they did it. I was only 10 years old at the time, but I will say I'm a little surprised to hear that. I think you said even in 2030 there will be vulnerabilities. That given the amount of computer power we have, it's just a shame that it's used against us almost more easily than used for us. Obviously, the systems for counting and tabulating votes is trivial now, but so are the attacks and the vulnerabilities. I don't think I'm saying anything new here, but
I would also like to point out an important thing about the public participation. A lot of the U.S. allies, the Western democracies, have in their constitution a requirement that a common man or woman has to be able to understand how the elections are conducted and has to be able to audit the election with no special training or no special tools. So until we live in a Star Trek universe where teenagers are talking casually about quantum physics, I'm probably not going to be explaining to the 75-year-old poll worker how homomorphic encryption, which is the most promising technology, will work. So the problem is when we look where the promises are, how the technology can solve this, homomorphic encryption is the number one. There's not very many thousand people in the planet Earth who actually understand how it works. So then you become an even bigger trust issue, because now the math is so complex, and the implementation of from discrete, non-discrete math, which is from the chalkboard to actual code, the implementation and deployment, it just becomes to the point where a skillful programmer cannot verify the code. And how do you really want to go? Should we really think about going to a place where you are in such a small pool of people on the planet who actually understand how the elections are conducted and can verify it?
And if I might add, I would just beg everybody to zoom out a little and reframe the security question. I think you can be highly secure and vulnerable. I think that's just the state of things and always will be. The key is, can you recover from an attack at your vulnerability point? And we can certainly do that. I think about, like, my basement would always get water in it. And then finally, I built a little trench and put in a sump pump and just let the water in and pump it out, and I've got a dry living space. You know, I wasn't able to defend myself against the water. I was able to accept it, push it out, and live in a dry place. And so that's kind of the way I'd ask you to think about security, specifically election security.
I'd like to introduce one other dimension, if that were not all enough, right? So we made the case that you can potentially keep voters from voting because you compromise the database, right? They don't get the ballot. Or we've made the case that they could vote, but the vote could be compromised. And some have hinted that the tabulation could be compromised. So you could compromise this physically before, during, or after the vote. There's another complete dimension of this problem, though, and that's the psychological dimension of the American voting public losing confidence that they should even bother to vote, right? So if you combine suspicion planted into the system across social media platforms that it doesn't make sense to go out today, it's cold in November in Chicago, the lines are long, and by the way, there's all this potential that your vote won't count or you'll get turned away at the door. Maybe that's the soft target here. And it's our confidence as Americans that the practice of voting isn't worth it anymore. And so that psychological dimension is the sort of thing that the Russian intelligence services have done for generations. Vladimir Putin is a former Russian intelligence officer. He just happens to be the most senior official with that capacity today. So they will look, as Hari said, for the softest, most vulnerable spot with the biggest impact, right? So maybe that's psychological. It's not even physical.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Sure.
Thank you for what you're doing. Question on the relatively small amount of companies that produce voting machines. Is there like an open source or sort of a public trust type of solution to that oligopoly?
I think Hari and Noah probably both have ideas.
So currently not in the United States. There are a couple of initiatives internationally, for example in Australia, to do an open source voting system. In the United States it's a proprietary code. There are a couple of initiatives again where initiatives to create an open source voting system. There's also an open source auditing tool. I started a project called Votoscope, which then later became an OpenCount funded by the Secretary of State, California. It is an open source software which enables you to take the images of the ballot scanned by a commercially available high-speed scanner and reprocess those. And so basically conduct an audit or recount or whatever you want to call it unofficially, but in your convenience at home. So that's in the GitHub. So, but that's not an election system, that's a system to verify the results.
Noah, did you have something?
No.
Okay. Good. Actually, we decided that it didn't necessarily make sense for the rollout of the plan today, but one of the things that I know is being discussed at the federal level is DARPA, and DHS has its own kind of mini DARPA called the Office of or Division of Science and Technology, are looking at potentially funding open source solutions in this space. And I would certainly encourage Congress to include that as part of the funding that they need to put out to enable folks to implement the plan Noah's put out.
And I want to underline again my point, which is defense is nearly impossible. We certainly want to raise the baseline. But if you have a ballot image and you audit it, the software that you originally ran the election on is irrelevant. So what's helped for us when voters ask about security, we start at the end and say, I've got a piece of paper for every voter. I audit the election. God forbid there's a successful breach, we can reconstruct this. Then we don't spend 4 hours in the rabbit hole of defense. I think that's a really strong, secure posture to stand in, and if everybody were so situated, every election official, then we could scream broadly that we are absolutely 100% secure, even if we're vulnerable and can't defend ourselves.
I would like to point out that open source, I love open source. Open source doesn't mean it's secure. It just means that more eyeballs can look and find the vulnerabilities. I fundamentally believe voting systems should be open source for psychological reasons. The question is, who owns your vote? Can anyone put a legal barrier like Digital Millennium Copyright Act between you and how your vote is processed? Open source is a solution, and open source licensing models are a solution to make the vote and the material to be owned by the county and owned by the people.
Absolutely. So I did see a couple other hands go up, and we can take a few more questions. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I can talk. So basically, you mentioned homomorphic encryption. So it kind of came to my mind about. So you have paper on this side of spectrum, and you have other like physics method, like quantum physics. So I know in Switzerland back in 2008, 2009, they have implemented a quantum cryptographic method to transmit ballots from the voting stations back to the main storage location. So is this a method that you guys are looking at, or? Thank you.
So the traditional Swiss way of conducting elections is that when in a canton, when the polls are closed, the doors are opened, and people pour in with their bottles of wine and cheese, and they start watching when the ballots are counted. And that is the great community participation. It's a community participation in the process, it's a public event, and it's a public trust builder because there's no place to hide. Obviously, people are looking for different implementation technology. I'm not a US citizen, I'm from Finland. We did try once electronic voting in 3 counties, failed. We found a flaw in the results, and actually all the 3 counties needed to be re-elected with paper. So these trials have been carried out, and the trials have failed. The other part is a common phrase which is always used is that internet voting or online voting will activate young voters. When you look at the cities which have conducted online voting, like Estonia, you see that actually the fastest growing group is over 65-year-olds. Young people don't vote online. That's because young people have been playing games and they're secret. I love World of Warcraft myself. I would be horrified if my weapons are stolen. But that's really the thing. Young people understand the risk, and election is very unique environment because in election you have to get it right first time. The secret ballot and auditability, you can have either or in online, but you cannot have both. And since the Constitution says secret ballot in a number of countries, you end up in a situation where you have to either give up the auditability or you can't do online, and that's why you don't have the option of online voting. Today's technology doesn't have it.
Okay, so why don't we take the last question from one of my students? So Jen, go ahead.
Thank you, and I'm going to hold you to your word about the extra credit.
All right. Done.
So half the panel here are, national security experts, and throughout, this conversation, we've talked a lot about the defense side and how to fortify our systems, which I think is great. But I'd like to talk about, the offensive side. So, in football, they say that defense wins games, and I believe that. But how can we just get the other team off the field? And so, what kind of policies can we create in the future to address, try and get foreign actors to not attack our systems?
Espionage is as old as the oldest profession. I don't think it's gonna end because it's so essential to nation-state interaction. I do think ultimately there's going to need to be a standard, an international standard of behavior, as we have done with nuclear weapons and other sorts of things around these issues. Right now, people don't want to do that for obvious reasons in terms of it being to their advantage. But I don't think, and why it's so important, I think what Noah and Sean said, in this case, protecting yourself is as important as being offensive in this particular area. And in our system, with 9,000 local election officials, helping those 9,000 officials be more understanding of what the risk is, how to defend, how to detect, and how to be resilient is the way in which we have done crisis management in this country since 9/11. We know terrorists are out there. We're working like hell to try to kill as many of them as we can or to disrupt their activities, but we also recognize that there is no perfect world. And so we have to be sure from a defensive perspective that we're confident that we will see, detect, defend, detect, and become resilient when this does happen, and it will happen again. So I don't think you'll ever stop it, but you can certainly make it much harder for it to happen with the kinds of recommendations that Noah and the Cook County team have put together with the work of DHS and certainly with the work of your intel community. DEFCON was a stroke of genius, I think, in terms of doing it there because it really got a lot of attention. Sherri, you may have other thoughts along that line.
I have a couple comments. So I actually agree with you, ideally. Just as we don't want to fight a physical war in the U.S. on our territory, nor do we really want a cyber fight in the U.S. on our territory, right? So obviously we would, if there's going to be a fight anywhere, we'd like it to be out there somewhere and not within our boundaries. Part of the problem is that today the laws actually don't allow that. So there needs to be a great deal of thought put into that. So you can't just go, if you think somebody is mucking around, you can't just go destroy them. And then there's actually issues associated with that as well. Because if you look at the way a lot of the hackers do business, they go through entities like hospitals and schools and all kinds of things. And so if we do the preemptive attack or even the attack back, as we call it, who are you really attacking? You know, what if you attack back and it turns out they were using a hospital and you destroy and people die? So there's all kinds of unintended consequences there that we really have to worry about. And then the third point I'll make there is right now, maybe other than Estonia, the U.S., I'll just say, is one of the most networked countries in the world. That makes us probably one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. And so the fear is for retaliation, that it might actually come back worse. And so we really need to get our house in order in terms of our policy, our laws, our collaboration, among government and industry and academia. And this is just a really, really hard problem. And I'll say we thought the nuclear problem was hard. I'll say in hindsight that's not even in the ballpark of how hard this is with all the different issues. And then the second part is, even if we do get some sort of international standard, the hard part is verification. You know, with nukes, the verification is relatively easy. You can go count them, assuming, they're being honest and not trying to hide them. And it's probably pretty hard to do that. how do you count cyber attacks? You know, what is the standard going to be, and how do we verify that everyone is living by the standard? So those are just some of the issues. So although I absolutely agree with what you said, in theory, in practice, it's just really hard to put that into practice. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And thank you, Noah, for putting this program together. It's sorely needed in our country. So thank you.